The political rift in America is widening, and it's happening faster than most of us realize. It's not just about Democrats versus Republicans anymore. It's not just tax policy or healthcare. It's deeper. It's about worldviews that frame reality itself. On both the left and the right, people believe they have God on their side. And whenever God enters politics, the conflict becomes sacred, uncompromising, and absolute. Now, why does this matter? Because when people invoke God, they're not just saying, "I'm right." They're saying, "This is divine. This is part of a plan." And that changes everything. If you believe your side is backed by God, compromise becomes betrayal. Facts that challenge your position become irrelevant. Evidence is no longer persuasive because the argument is no longer about evidence. It's about faith. This happens on the religious right, where God is said to demand obedience on issues like marriage, abortion, or national identity. But it also happens on the religious left, where God is framed as demanding justice, inclusion, or liberation. The language is different, but the pattern is the same. Politics becomes moral warfare, and opponents become enemies of God rather than fellow citizens. And that belief that God has a plan makes division worse. Because if God already has a plan, then human beings don't have to solve problems here and now. They just have to wait for divine intervention. They don't have to wrestle with complexity or compromise or humility. They just have to hold the line until God fixes it. This mindset stops us from realizing the truth. There is no divine plan. There is no better place waiting for us. There's only here. And it only gets better if we make it better. Think about it. The idea of a divine plan is comforting because it means suffering has meaning, injustice will be corrected, and history is headed toward redemption. But history shows otherwise. Injustice doesn't fix itself. Wars don't end themselves. Civilizations don't automatically get better. Things only improve when people do the hard work of making them better. When we pretend that God will intervene, we surrender that responsibility. This belief in a divine plan also feeds polarization because it casts your side as the chosen side in a cosmic drama. Your opponents aren't just wrong, they're standing in the way of God's design. That's why both sides become so convinced of their moral purity. It's not just politics anymore, it's prophecy. And that mindset locks people into echo chambers, fuels conspiracy theories, and justifies the worst actions as long as they're on God's side. But here's the alternative. What happens when we take God out of the equation? Suddenly, we see the world not as a waiting room for heaven, but as the only place we'll ever have. We see each other not as chosen and damned, but as fellow human beings with the same fate, fragile, temporary, and interconnected. We stop waiting for someone else to solve our problems and realize the work is ours. If the world is going to be better, it's because we make it better, together, for everyone. That shift is powerful. Without a divine plan, we realize that meaning isn't handed down to us, it's created by us. Justice isn't inevitable, it has to be built. Peace isn't destined, it has to be fought for. And democracy doesn't survive on autopilot. It survives because ordinary people choose to uphold it. So the rift between left and right doesn't heal by doubling down on God. It heals by humility. By recognizing that no side has a monopoly on truth, no scripture has all the answers, and no divine plan is unfolding behind the scenes. What we have is each other, right here, right now. And that's enough. Because if we commit to building a world rooted in evidence, compassion, and unity, then the future isn't written by God. It's written by us. We're living through a rare and dangerous widening of political division in the United States. It's not just policy disagreement anymore. It's social separation, moral contempt, and a basic breakdown of shared reality. Why has the rift grown so fast? And why do both the left and the right often end up saying in different words, God is on our side? At the highest level, there are three overlapping drivers: structural change, psychological wiring, and information systems, each amplifying the other. First, structural change. Over the last few decades, Americans have sorted themselves into more ideologically homogeneous communities. Parties have become more coherent and internally consistent. People self-select neighborhoods, workplaces, religious congregations, and media ecosystems that reinforce their views. This partisan sorting increases social distance and reduces the everyday cross-cutting ties that once softened disagreements. The result? Politics stops being about debate and becomes about preserving group identity. Pew Research Center. Second, our psychology. Human beings are not primarily truth-seeking machines. We are storytelling, status-seeking, tribal animals. Cognitive tendencies like motivated reasoning and confirmation bias mean we reach for explanations that make us feel coherent and morally righteous, and then we rationalize them. Moral foundations theory shows how liberals and conservatives emphasize different moral taste buds: care, fairness versus loyalty, authority, sanctity, which makes opposing positions feel not merely wrong, but morally corrupt. That's why political disagreement quickly becomes moral condemnation. Oasis Research Repository. Third, the information environment. Social media algorithms, influencer economies, and fragmented news sources accelerate polarization. Platforms reward emotionally intense, shareable content. Outrage travels faster than nuance. People increasingly get news from influencers and niche channels that confirm a worldview rather than test it. This creates feedback loops that intensify certainty and foster echo chambers. A large and growing body of research links digital platforms and algorithmic recommendation to increased political polarization and misinformation spread. PMC. When you combine these structural, psychological, and technical forces, you get accelerating polarization. People cluster socially, interpret information through identity-protecting lenses, and have their worst impulses amplified by algorithms. Why God is on our side fuels both the left and the right. Religion can, and often does, moderate politics. But religious belief can also be enlisted as political ammunition. Saying God is on our side works for both camps, and it does so in predictable ways. 1. Moral certainty as political fuel. When political claims are wrapped in divine language, they become moral imperatives rather than negotiable policy proposals. If your side's program is God's will, compromise becomes betrayal. This dynamic is not limited to one party. Religious conservatives often frame policy issues, abortion, marriage, education, as moral mandates, while religious progressives can frame other policies, immigration, climate justice, racial equity, as moral commands of conscience. The effect is the same: higher emotional stakes and lower willingness to trade. American Academy of Arts and Sciences 2. Scriptural literalism as a weapon. Literal readings of Scripture create a clear cognitive rule. If the text seems to command X, then X is non-negotiable. Politicians and movements exploit literalism because it turns policy into dogma. On the opposite side, a secularized version of the same logic sometimes emerges. Ideological texts, or sacred progressive narratives, are treated as non-negotiable truths. Both are forms of sanctified conviction. American Academy of Arts and Sciences 3. Group identity and divine favor. Belief that God favors us enhances group cohesion and supplies psychological defenses against doubt. When people believe their group has divine backing, they interpret threats as spiritual warfare rather than political disagreement, and they respond accordingly: mobilization, demonization of enemies, reduced empathy. 2. Instrumentalization by elites. Political actors, parties, media figures, religious leaders sometimes use religious language strategically to rally a base. This can be sincere or cynical, but either way, it fuses spiritual rhetoric with political aims. Over time, ritualized religious language becomes part of partisan signaling. It's how you show you belong. American Academy of Arts and Sciences. The mechanics: how religious language produces polarization. Sacralization of politics. Once a political cause is sacred, evidentiary debate loses power. Disagreement is treated as impiety. That intensifies polarization because the normal tools of democratic compromise, evidence, negotiation, mutual concessions, are delegitimized. Moral world models. A religious narrative frames reality in cosmic terms: good versus evil, chosen versus corrupt. When politics adopts that cosmology, opponents cease to be mere rivals and become existential threats. Feedback loops with media. Religiously framed narratives get amplified by partisan media and social platforms. Viral sermons, charismatic influencers, and partisan punditry translate theological claims into mobilizing political content. Identity entanglement. Religious identity overlaps with racial, regional, and class identities in the U.S. That bundling makes political choices a form of social belonging. Leave the belief and you risk losing your community. Keep it and you risk staying in a hostile political coalition. These mechanics are why appeals to God on our side both deepen commitment and harden the opposing side's resistance. Consequences: why this is dangerous. Erosion of deliberative norms. When people believe they possess revealed truth, they stop reasoning in good faith. That degrades public debate and makes democratic governance harder. Pew Research Center. Normalization of political violence. Sacred framing increases the odds of rhetorical dehumanization, which removes friction against violence. Studies show polarized contexts have higher risks of political violence and civic instability. Carnegie Endowment. Institutional capture and distrust. As religious and political identities fuse, public institutions, schools, universities, courts become contested battlegrounds rather than common resources, fueling cycles of mistrust. Sage Journals. What perpetuates the dynamic, the practical incentives? Click and ad economies. Outrage pays. Media outlets and influencers get metrics and money for polarizing content. This rewards sacred framing because it's more emotionally potent. PMC, political gain from identity politics. Winning coalitions sometimes require uncompromising stances to secure turnout and loyalty, reinforcing hardline rhetoric. Religious institutions under pressure. Churches and denominations feel political pressure to choose sides. Some leaders amplify partisanship to retain members, while others withdraw into prophetic critique. Both can intensify polarization. American Academy of Arts and Sciences. How to reduce the rift. Practical, evidence-based approaches. There is no single fix. Polarization is multi-causal, but research and practice suggest a multi-pronged strategy. 1. Restore intergroup contact and cross-cutting ties. People who have friends across the aisle are less hostile. Programs that foster sustained, structured contact, community projects, mixed deliberative forums, integrated workplaces, reduce effective polarization. Contact theory. Carnegie Endowment 2. Strengthen institutions that mediate conflict. Civic education, independent media standards, transparent governance, and judicial independence help create shared reality. When institutions are trusted and functional, sacred claims are less likely to substitute for evidence. 2. Promote intellectual humility and epistemic norms. Teaching people how to reason, spot motivated reasoning, and tolerate uncertainty reduces the need to sacralize beliefs. Interventions that foster intellectual humility show promise in reducing polarized certainty. Taylor and Francis, Online 4. Religious leadership rediscovering prophetic voice. When religious leaders reclaim ethical critique instead of partisan signaling, they can model humility and common good. Historic examples show religious institutions can either inflame or heal divisions depending on leadership choices. American Academy of Arts and Sciences. 5. Platform and algorithmic reforms, reducing attention economics that reward outrage, increasing transparency, and promoting content that encourages deliberation over spectacle would reduce amplification of sacred rhetoric. Policymakers and platforms can pilot recommender changes and measure results. Science 6. Deliberative and restorative forums. Citizens' assemblies, mediated dialogues, and restorative practices can break down demonization and replace caricature with context. These formats work by making people listen and be heard, not by scoring debate points. Final point: humility as the political vaccine. If there's a single cultural quality that undercuts God is on our side politics, it's humility. Humility recognizes fallibility and the limits of any one narrative. It doesn't demand abandoning conviction. It asks that convictions be held without turning them into sacred identity. The most resilient democracies don't expect everyone to agree on deep values. They rely on a shared commitment to rules, evidence, and mutual respect. We're not doomed to permanent deep division, but getting out of our current trap requires deliberate cultural and institutional work. It demands leaders who will reduce the stakes of political identity, media systems that reward curiosity over rage, and religious voices willing to separate spiritual truth from partisan advantage.